Okay, and so without further ado, let me give an introduction to our featured speaker tonight. Our featured guest is Shane Wiegand, and for the past 8 years, Shane has been working as an elementary classroom teacher at Rush Henrietta School District. And this work really started with a pretty simple question. And any of us who you had any experience working with kids, sometimes some of the most simple questions are the most profound and the most life-changing. And I haven't asked Shane specifically about this. My guess is that's what he would say, specific to the question he was asked, which was, does Rochester have a history of civil rights and civil rights movements? And Shane didn't know. And he and his class went on an exploration. And what has blossomed from this is just an incredible project. And really, I would say what's become a life's work, if I could say that. So outside of school, Shane is engaged in various efforts to fight racism, promote equity, foster culturally responsive social studies curriculum throughout Monroe County, and improve his. Shane gives presentations at schools, universities, churches, and neighborhood associations on the local history of segregation, redlining in Greater Rochester. He serves on the board of the City Roots Community Land Trust, serves as treasurer on the board of the Beechwood Neighborhood Coalition, and sits on the board of Connected Communities. He's also an adjunct instructor in the neurology department at the URMC, where he focuses on issues surrounding equity. And Shane is also, in his spare time, I guess, working with the Past Stones Foundation to help create a curriculum, a group of learning experiences that we hope will be shared throughout Monroe County in 4th, 8th, and potentially 12th grade to really explore the history of segregation and redlining and resistance in the Greater Rochester area. So I can't tell you how excited I am to turn this evening over to Mr. Shane Wiegand. Shane, thank you so much for coming.
Hi, Terry. It's really an honor to be here. Thank you for having me. I want to thank the Fire Steering Committee for having me as well as the Webster community. Growing up in Webster, I loved growing up in Webster and going to Webster schools. I went to Plank North and Spry and then Webster Schrader. And it was really cool a couple weeks ago to get to share this presentation with the teachers at Schrader and Thomas and get to see some of my old teachers. It was a really cool experience. I'm a little bit older than when I last walked those halls in Webster and quite a bit balder. And it's fantastic to be here and share with you all. So I want to tell a little bit of my story, our story in Webster and the larger Monroe County, state, and national story around racist policies, the ways that people resisted, particularly here in Monroe County and Webster, so that we can tell a truer story about our community, one that's more of our story, so that we can come together and build a more just and equitable Rochester. On the front screen here, you'll see the redlining map, which we'll talk quite a bit about. And on the right, you'll see the Reverend Gibson marching in protest in 1962 at Rochester City Hall in a protest that looks very similar to today and about a similar topic about issues with the Rochester Police Department, which we'll talk about later in this presentation. A quick note that if you do put something in the chat, I'll ask Terry that if there is a question that comes up that you read it for me, if it can't wait till the end. Otherwise, I just can't see the chat while I'm presenting. So a quick note about the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project. It's really more, we're doing case studies and learning experiences for kids. We're focusing this fall on grades 4, but we're also doing some piloting and work in grades 8 and 12. We've gotten to work with a number of Webster teachers who are helping us with this, piloting it, and have gone through our 3-hour training. This is our writing team. The project is co-led by me and Kelly McNair, who is one of the leaders in the RCSD and does a lot of great equity work throughout our community. And this spring, we plan to be developing curriculum in grades 2 and 5. All of this is going to be free, open source resource for districts like Webster to use and adapt for their specific needs and community story. And we're really just excited to have the support of many local funders to be able to do this at least for the next 3 years. And it's been really an honor to work with Terry and many of the great teachers here in Webster. Before we get into the presentation, I want to do a little bit of prep. I want to talk about some of the sources that I'm going to cover. The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein is the book on racist housing policy in the United States. Rothstein is a best-selling, incredible author. He came to Rochester a few years ago. We were on a panel together about this topic. He's actually been through this whole presentation, and he found 2 mistakes. I misspelled a date and a name, but it's fixed now. And the people whose names I misspelled were on the Supreme Court a really long time ago. So it's all good. We're set. It's Rothstein smiled upon. I'm going to take a big peek at the New York State Commission Against Discrimination from 1958, the Democrat and Chronicle archives, the Rochester Voices Project, and countless interviews that I've gotten to have with people of color, Latinx folks, and white folks in our community that engaged in the movement to bring racial equity to Rochester back in the 40s all the way up till today. And I hope to share just a slice of some of those stories so that we might learn from it and apply that to today. I want to just talk about a couple of really quick definitions before we begin. Racism, I'll be using Ibram Kendi's book, who defines it as a marriage of racist policy and ideas that produce and normalize racial inequality. It's not about your intentions, but it is about the impact. I don't know my grandfather's intentions when he participated in some of these racist housing policies. I know he was a great, nice, kind man, right? But at the same time, part of those actions, the impact of them had to do with segregation in our community. For example, with myself in college, I remember telling a student of color that I didn't see their race, I didn't see their color. I treat everyone the same. And the student of color said, "You saying you don't see an important part of who I am and my identity, that hurts me. I think that's kind of racist." And I got so defensive. I was like, "How can you call me that? I'm like the nicest person you've ever met. My intentions are the best." And the student said, "It doesn't matter what your intentions are. The impact is that you hurt me and you're failing to see an important part of who I am, as well as the racism that I have to deal with every day. And if you're saying that you're colorblind, how can you see those things?" And that defensiveness I felt, and then that awareness that I started to feel after hearing that comment from that peer of mine in college, it started to open me up and made me realize there is so much I didn't realize about race, about racism, and about what it takes to build an equitable world. An anti-racist policy, what we hope to do is any measure that has the impact or produces and sustains racial equity between racial groups. These are rules, curriculums, procedures, processes, regulations, and guidelines that govern people. The impact is the key. So what do? I want to acknowledge that today we're going to talk about some hard things. We're going to talk about a story in our community that isn't always told. It's a story that I personally didn't really hear growing up from my family, from my church, or from the Webster School District. And it's a story that sometimes can make us feel a little uncomfortable about ourselves. It's a story that's better left sometimes in our minds unsaid. And yet I want to invite us to tell this story because I think a big missing piece of what's keeping us from moving forward isn't talking about what happened and how we got here. And so in those moments where you see yourself in this story and you feel that discomfort or you feel that defensiveness, I just want to encourage you to pause, take that deep breath, be curious about why you're feeling that way, stay with us, and remember this quote. D'Angelo writes, "The key to moving forward is what do we do with our discomfort? We can use it as a door out, blame the messenger, disregard the message, or use it as a door in by asking, why does this unsettle me? And what would it mean for me if it were true?" Because the thing is, in our community, we've had huge problems in the past around race and equity. We had slavery in New York State until the early 1800s. People like Frederick Douglass helped bring people together to fight back against slavery and injustice in our community. Folks like Daniel Penfield, which Webster later became, what Webster was Penfield, and then eventually became Webster. But Penfield himself was an owner of human beings that were enslaved right here in what is today now Webster and Penfield. And so we have that legacy, but also the legacy of people like Austin Stewart, enslaved in New York State, escaped to Rochester during the same period of time and worked tirelessly to end slavery, running a spot on the Underground Railroad, the first Black-owned business in Rochester, as well as opening the first school for students of color in the Rochester community, bringing together all kinds of folks, including allies in Webster who helped run spots and locations on the Underground Railroad. I love that legacy that we have in Webster and across our county, helping to end slavery across our community after we ended it here. And there's Daniel Penfield's home, where he actually kept enslaved Africans. I want to talk about Susan B. Anthony, folks like her and many others like Hester Jeffries, who came together to fight for women's rights and equity. Of course, great innovators like George Eastman, who changed the way we see the world, but left legacies that are a little more complicated than we always talk about, which I'll get to soon. Because the thing is, in the past, we've come together as a community across all different backgrounds to solve these kinds of problems by looking at them, face on, head on, and deciding we can come together and we can solve them. And we've got big problems to solve again. The 2020 Act Rochester Hard Facts Report tells us that African-American kids in our region, they're more than 4 times as likely as whites to live in poverty. That both African-Americans and Latinos in our community, they're less than half as likely to own their own homes as their white counterparts. How do we get to a place that when you look at our census dot map that shows each individual person that lives in our community, one blue dot standing for a white person, one green for Black, you can see our suburbs and communities like Webster and Penfield and Greece and Gates are incredibly white, and our inner city is predominantly African-American and Hispanic. In fact, New York State has the most segregated schools in the entire country. And the border between Rochester and Penfield Central School District is the #1 most segregating school district border in all 50 United States. Life expectancy in our community. In fact, white privilege can literally mean life itself here in Rochester, because a child from Pittsburgh's majority white 14534 zip code born today will live up to 9 years longer than a child born in Rochester's previously redlined majority Black 14608 zip code today. We also have incredible gaps when it comes to wealth, not the income, but how much wealth and assets people have based along racial lines, just an absurd difference. And so when we look at all of these problems, it feels overwhelming. And I want us to draw on the legacy of people that faced this head on before, like Douglas and Anthony and Jeffries and Stewart and so many others. And I want to tell those stories today, but I want to invoke these words from the great James Baldwin as sort of the central thesis or message of the presentation that I want to give tonight, and invite you to try to live these out as we hear this story and respond to it. Baldwin writes, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And let us do this in the tradition of folks who have always faced this, the people of color who have tirelessly fought for hundreds of years in this community to make these changes. Meet Howard Coles, editor of the Black newspaper, the Frederick Douglass Voice. His daughter Joan is actually on our advisory board for our curriculum project. In the 1930s, actually 38 after redlining really began in full steam here in Rochester, Coles fought back. He did a massive housing study that found that Black people were being forced into just 2 neighborhoods of the city of Rochester. He found that in many of those homes, over 30% of them didn't have running water, and many didn't have heat. He pushed back, he called out the city, and yet changes weren't made. Dr. Anthony Jordan, second Black doctor in Rochester, he found that housing was directly related to health equity, especially along racial lines, finding that the Black death rate from all causes was 50% higher than that of whites. And the tuberculosis death rate among people of color in our community was 2.5 times that of whites. And again, directly linked to housing. The NAACP, founded by Jacob Knox and Howard Coles and Harper Sibley and many others, found in 1947 that actually the University of Rochester would not allow students of color into their medical or nursing programs. They fought for over 10 years and eventually sued and forced the University of Rochester to allow just 1 Black student in each year. Today, there have only been just over 80 Black male students to graduate from the University of Rochester medical program. So while there have been gains, the gains have not been enough. Folks like Reverend Body of Mount Olivet Baptist Church, 1946, almost 10 years after Howard Coles, continued to raise this problem with housing, saying that the housing situation has always been an enigma to people of color. Here in Rochester, only 2 areas have been gracefully made available for him. And if any attempt is made to move out of these Black ghettos, those attempts are met with opposition. And today, I want to talk about that opposition, specifically in the form of systemic and institutional racism, racist policies like these specific ones. The racist policies of the real estate industry's Code of Ethics, something called racially restrictive covenants, the 1934 National Housing Act, the redlining and the VA and FHA mortgages that came out of that, as well as urban renewal and displacement. And I want to take a peek at some of the anti-racist efforts that happened in Webster, as well as some of those policies. We're going to look at the whole county, and we'll do a little bit of zooming in on some pieces of Webster as we go. A note about the time period, it's called the Great Migration from 1910 to 1970, when millions of African Americans migrated from the South to the North, fleeing white domestic terrorism in the form of Klansmen, as well as white citizens' councils, lack of voting rights, and coming to communities like Rochester in search of better jobs. But originally they didn't come, at least until the 60s, to work at places like Kodak and Bausch and Lomb. A New York State Commission on Discrimination found that actually those companies did not hire African Americans and had that policy. Instead, people of color came from Sanford, Florida. A majority came from Sanford, Florida, to pick fruit in towns like Webster and rural areas, towns where they weren't welcome to live unless they stayed in camps. And so they eventually made their way to downtown Rochester. And we'll talk a little more about that. First area of racist policy, though, I want to cover today is the real estate industry. That real estate agents across our country to this day are governed by something called the National Association of Real Estate Boards. And until 1956, for over 30 years, they had a code of ethics. And on the front page, it said it was governed, all real estate agents were governed by the biblical code to love your neighbor as yourself. You read farther down into that code of ethics and an interpretation of what it means to read love your neighbor as yourself, something that if you don't follow, you can lose your real estate license, and many did. It said this: a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or any individuals whose presence will be clearly detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. Howard Coles, who you met just a bit earlier, he was one of the people of color who decided, I'm going to get a real estate license and I'm going to spit in the face of this racist law. He started showing Black people homes in white neighborhoods like the 19th Ward. Men like Frank Drum, our local president, and many of his peers, they worked hard and pushed Howard Coles out of the real estate industry and anybody else who tried to show people of color homes in white neighborhoods. And they were largely successful. In fact, Dr. Walter Cooper, a PhD in chemistry, graduate from the University of Rochester, when he came to Rochester, he and his wife, Helen, couldn't find an apartment. He writes, we answered ads for 69 apartments and were refused at all of them. Dr. Cooper is a good friend. He's on our board for the curriculum project. You're going to hear a lot more about his and his wife's story as we go throughout our presentation today. But it's just staggering that he would answer 69 ads and yet find nowhere to live until finally an apartment opened up in the red-lined Beechwood neighborhood, where I actually live today in the city of Rochester. In 1957, in the 19th Ward, the story of Dr. Alice Holloway Young later became the first Black principal in all of Monroe County at WCSD, and she faced the real estate industry and the local KKK. A really interesting story here. Dr. Young actually wanted to buy a house, her and her husband, James. They're upper middle class folks. They go to the bank, and a single bank will pre-approve them for a mortgage. Not a single real estate agent will show them a home in the 19th Ward, an all-white neighborhood where they wanted to live. So she did what the 57 other people of color did at that time. They found a wealthy white person like Harper Sibley, the Western Union Telegraph fortune, who were part of the NAACP, and reached out and bought them a house that they didn't get to see, didn't get to tour, sight unseen, bought it for them and did a private mortgage to them under the table. The next day, they found this note in their mailbox, signed from the Ku Klux Klan of Millbank Street. For years, they faced racial terror, cross burnings, epithets, slurs, all kinds of things. And it was incredible. And yet the Youngs refused to move. Alice Young is a friend of mine, and when we've had lunch, she asked that when I share her story, I mention the Bush family, the only white family on the street who stood with them against the racial abuse and terror and helped them stay in that home for the next 17 years and usher in some systemic change when it comes to housing in our community. We don't think of our community as a Klan community. They think of that as the South. This is East Rochester, though, in 1926, in the DNC, 8,000 Klansmen in their full robes and Model Ts celebrating white supremacy in what is today the practice field for the East Rochester football team. The next day, the gathering had over 20,000 people, as you can see below. The next piece of racist policy I want to talk about is something called racially restrictive covenants. So I think we've all heard about in the South, they have those white and black water fountains, that very public in your face symbol of segregation. Just as public, but less in your face is a racial covenant on a deed. So when you buy a house, you get a deed that says you own it. And on that deed, there are legally enforceable rules for how you're supposed to use that house. Things like you can see up here, like not having a detached garage or how far away from the lot line different things need to be. But something that was very popular were covenants that said things like number 5 here, that the dwelling shall be occupied by persons of the Caucasian race only. This was very popular in Rochester and was enforced throughout our community. Recently this summer, I helped write a report with City Roots Land Trust and the Yale Law School that documented these covenants and made recommendations about what to do about them. And we found some pretty wild statistics. And a lot of this came out of student efforts and student research, going down to the county clerk's office, going through the microfilm, and uncovering these deeds, this public information about our community. And one of the most staggering things we found is that the head of Monroe County, County Manager Clarence Smith, today Adam Bello has this job, him and the entire county legislature in 39 and 1940, they signed into all the deeds of tax foreclosed homes that they built in towns like Irondequoit, especially these streets, that no person of any race other than the Caucasian shall use or occupy any building or lot. Right? De jure segregation from the highest local government right here in upstate New York. But neighborhoods like Webster's Forest Lawn neighborhood over there by the bay and the lake had these kinds of covenants saying no Italian, no Black, and no Polish persons. These are actual photographs that we've taken. You can go down and look all of these things up. Webster wasn't alone, though, nor was Irondequoit. We had Kodak, who built the Meadowbrook neighborhood. In fact, on their website, they proudly share that there are 371 homes in Brighton, first tier, and they have their origin, notice this on the website, a carefully planned development. Well, it was so carefully planned that when Kodak created the Kodak Realty Corporation to build these homes and created ESL Bank to finance these homes, written into every one of these deeds was this racial covenant that said no lot or dwelling shall be sold to or occupied by a Black person. You can see Kodak Realty Corporation, Vice President Harry Haight, also a founder of ESNL. And as I mentioned earlier, Kodak did not hire people of color at their factories until James Lavelle in the 40s, who was an Olympic medalist. And then the next person of color was Dr. Jacob Knox, Sam Dent, and then the Coopers. So before 1960, there were only 5 or 6 people of color hired at Kodak until Fight came on the scene, which is a whole other story that we could dig into, but we don't have time for it today. I want to show you some other racial covenants advertised right in the Democrat and Chronicle as having rigid restrictions for desirable social character. You can see this other area here in Brighton, the Council Rock Estates. School districts got on board. Thomas Edison School number 4 in Gates said on underneath their school, some of their schools, that these lots shall never be used or occupied, including their school, by anyone who's not Caucasian. Pittsford by Oak Hill, the East Avenue Estates advertised the restrictions in the paper, and there's a copy of the deed. Parrington, East Rochester, Irondequoit, over 2,000 lots in West Irondequoit, one of the biggest developments that had one of these on every single home, including the home of Walter Wegman, founder of Wegmans, who agreed to this racist deed and ensured that the person he sold that home to several years later kept that racial covenant on their deed, even though they didn't have to. In Penfield, Dayton Corners in Penfield, Greece, Dewey Stone Tract, Denise, Marwood, Latona Homesteads. In fact, this wasn't just county government, it wasn't just Kodak, it was the head of the Rochester Builders Association, Norman Huck, the head of the Rochester Realtors Association, Frank Drum, who you met earlier, who put these on all 250 homes that they built by Brooklyn Country Club. The head of the Rochester Bar Association in 1939 put these on all the homes that he and his firm built in our community. I mean, this stuff went all the way to the highest leaders in our community, and the rest of the folks oftentimes were complicit. A number of neighborhoods in Rochester, as well as the 19th Ward. I want you to meet Judge Reuben Davis. He later became the first Black judge in Rochester, but in 1958, he faced these covenants firsthand. He says, it was 1958, we saw a house we liked in 135 Elmdorf Ave in Rochester, just a block or so west of Genesee Street. I'd say there were probably 4 Black families that lived anywhere west of Genesee at that time, including the Youngs. He goes on to say in his oral history, the owner refused to sell to us because we were Black, and there was a restrictive covenant in the deed that these houses, when built, were not to be sold to people of color or to Italians. He goes on to write that he and his friends at the NAACP used what his words are devious methods to acquire properties in these segregated neighborhoods. A white lawyer from the NAACP bought this home and then sold it to him under the table. A note about Italians, Jewish folks, Eastern Europeans, the eugenics science at the time deemed those people not white or Caucasian, and therefore they were technically in that Black almost category. Not that low, according to the race science, but below what Caucasian would be. And in fact, when many of these federal policies and local policies were coming out, they were not given access to home ownership oftentimes, especially if they were recent immigrants, Italians and Jewish folks. But in 1944, that changed. Italians and Jewish folks were deemed legally white with a GI Bill and given access to home ownership through federally subsidized mortgages when people of color were not until 1968. Here are some of the covenants we found in our community so far. Each black space represents one of those areas. Whole neighborhoods, and you can see how it ties in with redlining, which we're going to get to soon. We found about 10,000 of these covenants so far, but we estimate there's another 15 to 20,000 across our community. If our estimates are accurate, there's so much more microfilm to go through. The next area of racist policy is the New Deal, the National Housing Act of 1934. It was signed into law by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who of course was formerly the governor of New York State, and New York State Senator Wagner, who passed this law in the wake of the Great Depression to help us get out of our housing crisis and to explicitly help folks who were white have access to home ownership. It was a $119 billion subsidy that allowed our suburbs to be built. Towns like Webster, which were really just tiny villages, experienced massive booms after the passing of this law. And because of that investment, suburban housing and suburban subdivisions were able to be built, and school districts like Webster, in part, were created. And this was something that nationally happened. And written right into this law's underwriting manual, it said that if a neighborhood is to retain stability, it's necessary that properties continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. Racial segregation written right into the law. They go even farther, saying those deed restrictions I just showed you should be imposed on all land if you're building a new development and are a builder who wants your supplies financed by the federal government up front, like all of the Levitt towns built nationwide. Going on to say these deed restrictions should prohibit the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they are intended. Even mandating that highways built with federal funds be used to separate inharmonious racial groups, which is part of why 490 and the Inner Loop were located where they were. Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram Kendi. Ibram Kendi, an amazing author, he gives us a different way to kind of think about this, because we don't think of FDR as this like huge kind of like racist guy, or the things he did as, you know, these big racist policies, because he's from the North. We think of like more ignorant folks from the South, like a George Wallace, or angry on the steps of a school, like blocking Ruby Bridges' entrance somewhere, right? But what he writes is that time and again, powerful and brilliant men and women have produced racist ideas in order to justify the racist policies of their era. Put another way, in the book, So You Want to Talk About Race, the author writes that the ultimate goal of racism is the profit and the comfort of the white race, specifically of rich white men, of which I would include myself, my father, and both of my white grandfathers, who in the 50s and 60s received a VA and an FHA mortgage that allowed them to get a 30-year mortgage subsidized by the federal government with almost no money down to little money down, that allowed them to be homeowners and allowed them to build wealth, to build equity. Their homes quadrupled in value. They used that wealth from their homes to buy bigger homes, to build more wealth, and to send my parents to college, and then to help send me to college. When I was a young teacher and I crashed my car, I couldn't afford the repairs. The next day, that kind of wealth, it allowed me to have that $3,000 check in the mail to fix my car. Mistakes aren't as big when your family has wealth. And we know that wealth in our country is rooted in home ownership. And home ownership is rooted in this National Housing Act from 1934, which subsidized home ownership for over 35 million white families in our country. But let's talk a little bit more about how the government did this. They did it through something called redlining. This is what the law created. And it's the way they enforced the racial segregation and helped create home ownership in green line and suburban neighborhoods, which were deemed green or blue, best, most desirable, worthy of investment, places where white folks, 100% white folks lived. Yellow meant definitely declining. Maybe day laborers or maybe immigrants lived in those neighborhoods. Maybe the homes were a little bit older. Red meant hazardous, declining, and it meant people of color lived there. And if you got a hazardous rating, no investment could go into those neighborhoods from the federal government. And it was where people of color would be steered to live. So let's take a look at one of the government reports. This was the government assessor's report of the Cornhill redlined neighborhood, that 14608 zip code, where people are living up to 9 years less than they do in Pittsford. You can see it's 75% Black, 10% foreign, and the income is about $1,000 a year. You compare that to Pittsford's East Avenue Estates neighborhood by Oak Hill, 0% Black, therefore getting the blue rating, 0% foreign, and quadruple the income. Also, it didn't hurt that they had the racial covenants on all of those homes. To give you another example, comparing Beechwood to Meadowbrook, my neighborhood, 2% Black, redlined, right? Italian and mixed foreign also didn't hurt. Whereas in Meadowbrook, that Kodak built, that all-white neighborhood with the deed restrictions, 20 years later, 0% Black still, and given a green-lined rating, meaning if you're white, you can get government money to help you move there. If you're writing in the chat, I am not able to see what you're writing. Terry, if there is something that I need to address, please let me know. Meanwhile, all of the suburbs, Webster, Pittsford, Penfield, Fairport, they were green-lined, meaning if you were a white person, you could get a government-subsidized 30-year mortgage to buy a home or construct a home in those communities. In 1960, the most integrated community in Rochester was Henrietta. There were 11 individual Black people that lived in the town of Henrietta in 1960, the most integrated. This redlining, it worked in Rochester. Meanwhile, to give you some more scope and scale, Richard Rothstein, The Color of Law, he writes that the FHA and VA insured half of all new mortgages nationwide, and the rest of private mortgages, for the most part, banks followed the same government rules and regulations around segregating communities. The FHA and VA gave up over $119 billion in mortgage insurance. Over 35 million families, including mine, benefited from these FHA and VA-backed loans. 98% of these families were white. So you got to ask, how does Rochester, the home of Frederick Douglass, how do we respond to redlining and covenants and all this sort of stuff? We're the home of Douglass and Anthony, right? Don't we have a legacy of fighting for justice and equity and progress? And yet what was going on in almost every school across Monroe County, almost every fire department, town hall, Masons Club, Catholic and Protestant church, Grange halls like the Webster Grange, they held something called a blackface minstrel show, which gives some context to the ways these policies were actually welcomed in our community. This is 1960 in Honeyway Falls. You can see a typical blackface minstrel show in the school auditorium. A blackface show is when you have 4 or 5 main characters who use burnt cork to blacken their faces. They paint on racist, garish red lips, and they sing and dance and they sing Southern Confederacy songs that mock the intelligence of Black people. There's some political satire, there's some other kinds of songs and dances and shows, some drag, but most of all, there is a celebration of white supremacy going on in these shows. And these shows were seen as accepted. In fact, almost the Webster Herald to the Honeyway Falls Times, the Democrat and Chronicle, almost every single winter and spring would publish articles about, advertisements for, and just, celebrations of these shows in our community. This is 1960. But Webster High School in 1960 had one of these shows with the Webster Rotary Club. They called it an old-fashioned minstrel show with blackface, and the Webster High School singers participated at the father-daughter banquet. This is the Webster Auxiliary Fire Department put on by the Webster Women's Auxiliary. You can see this ad right here in the Webster Herald for their burnt cork white glove show. The town supervisor of Webster, who later went on to be the district attorney, John Barrett, would write and produce the Grange Hall show almost every year. That happened right at the Harmony House, I think, which is like where my terrible band in high school used to put on bad rock shows. And it's just wild that on that same stage, these racist shows like the Cotton Club, and I'm not going to read that word, COONS, would be put on yearly, written by him and performed by the residents of our town. But it wasn't just Webster, of course not. It was Kodak. They put on an annual show every year, and they proudly published photographs and articles in the Kodak magazine and newspaper. The Jewish Youth Association put on an annual show at the Lyndhurst Theater. RCSD at a number of schools, including school number 5. Allendale Private School had these shows almost every year as well, including at the Memorial Art Gallery and the Allendale Auditorium. The Pittsford Catholic Parish had an annual show, and they're Masons. You can see Newark Junior High School stage, RIT, and a whole host of other towns that hosted these shows annually. And you can see from these newspaper articles the acceptance of this and the message that was explicitly taught to students about how to view people of color. The NAACP really gets at this and the way these shows welcomed the racist housing policies that were happening in our community at this time. The Reverend Primo of the NAACP writes into the DNC, calling these shows out, saying they must be banned from all public and private schools, churches, public buildings, because to do otherwise is going to cripple permanently the attitudes of all white youth involved in these community accepted shows towards all the dark-skinned people of the world. It wasn't until the assassination of Dr. King that these shows started to peter out in communities like Webster and Penfield and Rochester and Fairport. So while this was welcomed in Rochester, there were many people of color who fought back. They went to the state trying to get change. And instead of change, they got what people often get. They got a report, a commission to study the issue. And while the commission didn't help folks too much at the time, it does tell us a whole lot about the full scope and scale of how these racist housing policies played out specifically in Monroe County. In 1950, the report found that 80% of all people of color in our community lived in the 3rd and 7th Ward red line neighborhoods of the city of Rochester. In those two neighborhoods, more than 1,600 units had either no bath or a shared bath, and in more than 2,000, there was more than one person living in each room, which spurred Connie Mitchell to run for office to become the first Black person to be elected to office in all of Monroe County. I learned about Connie Mitchell about 6 or 7 years ago. And she's someone I wish I had learned about growing up, and I hope that that's going to change. She said why she ran for office was because of redlining. She writes, "We were living in a community bursting at the seams because there wasn't open housing. When John and I bought our house in Gregg Street, the agent told us, I can't show you houses west of Jefferson Avenue. They're not open to Black people. So we were confined from Jefferson Avenue, that was where one of those red lines was, back to the river to look for a place to live on the west side of the city. Meanwhile, over 30% of the units in these two neighborhoods did not have running water. 20 years prior, Howard Coles had found similar data, and yet nothing had changed. In spite of the best efforts of local Black activists, only 57 Black families were able to own a home out of these two neighborhoods. One of them were the Wells, who joined the Coopers and the Lees in moving out to Henrietta in solidarity. There was quite a bit of violence and resistance when Black people tried to move into white neighborhoods. Meet the Biases, Dr. Thomas and Ermina Bias, who moved into West Irondequoit around 1960. After moving in, very quickly the Klan threw rocks through their living room windows. They received death threats and racial terror. They decided to sell their home and join the Coopers and Lees in Henrietta, just because Henrietta was the least populated of all of the suburbs. Meet Dick Ricketts, who the report writes about. He was the NBA star of Rochester's NBA team, the Royals, and it took him 16 months to find an apartment, even though he was wealthy and a celebrity in our community. But because of his skin color, he did not have access to an apartment that wasn't just a total slum condition. Peter Tolliver, a scientist who later went on to work at Xerox, in 1960, he and his wife bought a home in Verena Drive in Brighton. Now, before the deal had closed, the white neighbors on their street, an all-white street, came together, pooled their money, and went to the bank and bought the house out from under the Tollivers to prevent them from moving in. The Tollivers were part of the NAACP. They sued and eventually were able to make their way back into that home where Mrs. Tolliver still lives to this day. Meanwhile, the report says that not a single FHA or VA loan was given to any Black person in any of Rochester's suburbs, at least until 1958. Meanwhile, builders like the Farishes, the Hucks, the Drums were making hundreds of millions of dollars thanks to these federal subsidies that allowed them to get rich building homes in our community's suburbs, because our suburbs multiplied during this period of time. From 1950 to 70, Bureau Architecture tells us in their historic survey for Pittsford in 2017 that the reason towns like Pittsford and others grew in such size was explicitly because of the federal housing policies of the 30s through the 60s. Pittsford jumped from 9,000 to over 25,000 residents during this period of time. The next thing I want to talk about is urban renewal and displacement. The government gave Rochester over $30 million to help build things like the Inner Loop, to build 490, and to tear down what they termed slums, like the 3rd Ward and the 7th Ward, those red line neighborhoods. A public committee chaired by Elmer Milliman of Central Trust Bank, which later became M&T Bank, and John Dale oversaw this whites-only committee. Howard Coles tried to get on this committee, but because of the color of his skin, he did not have that access. Meanwhile, neighborhoods that had been places that, despite the disinvestment and segregation, folks had built community. They had built thriving areas where they had come together, jazz clubs like the Pithod in the Third Ward, the Elks Club, and all these different places where people of color and white folks would come together to dance, to listen to jazz. I mean, we were like the Clarissa Street was the Broadway of Rochester. And these neighborhoods were destroyed from urban renewal, and folks were pushed out of their homes. 886 families in the 7th Ward and 850 families lost their homes or apartments in the 3rd Ward during the 50s and the 60s. But they weren't able to move to the suburbs, and they weren't able to move to green and red line neighborhoods. So the boundary areas of these red line neighborhoods, like Jefferson Avenue, the white folks that lived in many of those homes decided, oh my gosh, let's separate our apartments or our house, single family homes into 5 units, and we can have up to 5 families sharing a kitchen and 1 bathroom, all living here. So there was massive overcrowding, all kinds of issue with this investment, lead paint, rats, lead poisoning, all these kinds of issues. Meanwhile, this urban renewal didn't just push people out of their homes, it destroyed religious institutions and places that were social hubs like the Church of God in Christ. And I want to tell their story in relation to urban renewal. On the right, you can see the Reverend Caldwell. He and his church raised money for 20 years. And in 1940, they finally finished construction of their church in the 7th Ward on Ormond Street. You can see him pictured in front of his church there. 20 years later, this thriving church was destroyed when the government decided that they needed to make way for business development. The business that was chosen to go there was the Pepsi Bottling Company, run by CEO Frank Staropoli. His son, Frank Staropoli Jr., told me that after that $1 million factory, subsidized by the federal government and on the land where this Black church used to be, never hired a single person of color. They did hire a single Black person. A few Hispanic folks were hired to work on the line, but he said that his father and uncle did never wanted to hire a person of color, and that when he took over in the 70s, he himself never hired a Black person to work on that factory. So it didn't even benefit those folks when it was built.
Hey, Shane,
oh yeah, go ahead, Terry.
maybe what we can do, this is just so much awesome information.
Oh yeah.
Maybe we can just let's just give everybody a second just to process.
Oh sure, yeah.
And also give you a chance to catch your breath, because and we have time. I mean, I know how excited you are, and just so much information here.
Oh, absolutely.
I just want to give everybody just a second just to process, and if there are questions. One of the questions that came up in the chat was specifically related to any mention in terms of Latinos or Hispanic folks, if that came up in any of your research.
Yes, Maria, that's a great question. Latinos were absolutely prohibited via the covenants. I think I mentioned that, but if I didn't, that was completely an accident on my part. I usually try to mention that people not of the Caucasian race would have included Latinx folks, Latino, Hispanic folks, people from Puerto Rico. Rochester didn't have a very significant number of Hispanic folks that lived here really until the early 1960s when the law started to change and Puerto Ricans were able to start to migrate. Folks like Don Samuel Torres has described coming to Rochester and facing extreme housing segregation. Many Latinos were forced into the 7th Ward neighborhood, the same neighborhood where the Church of God in Christ was, right here, that red line neighborhood. And they faced quite a few issues. And we have a whole bunch of stories, part of our curriculum project, that kind of tells some of that. But yes, there's no explicit reference to no Hispanic or no Asian on these deeds, but no persons other than the Caucasian race means no Latinos or Hispanic or Black folks. Absolutely. Great question.
Awesome.
Yep.
Thanks, Shane. Yeah. So just if anybody else has any questions right now for sort of that first part, you can always come back if you think of other things. But I'll just give a chance to, if you have a chat or a question you want to put in the chat. If not, then Shane has a chance to get a sip of water and get back and ready to go. Okay. Looks like Sandy Jennings.
Rubber. It's awesome.
It's.
Do you want to type the question in the chat there?
Oh yeah, Sandy, if you could type it in the chat, that would be great. I think it's Sandy. I'm sorry if it's not. I'm pretty sure it is, but. S.A. Jennings. I'm not sure.
She says there's been a lot of positive that have come since this history. Will we talk about those things too? Absolutely, we will talk about those things, but what our focus for today is the racist policies that help shape our community. And I know how we started, Sally, at the beginning, talking about how we have that home ownership gap in our community, almost 3 times as likely to own your own home if you're white compared to if you're Black or Latinx in our community. So we do still have these huge issues. Absolutely. Things like the Voting Rights Act, dramatically changed our country. We are going to talk about the 1968 Fair Housing Act in just a minute that did finally allow Black people access, but didn't give reparation for the almost 40 years and, of course, the centuries prior of where people of color didn't have access to housing or to the vote. But definitely, my aim is not to be down on our community, but to try to tell a part of the story that hasn't been told. I think the positives have been told quite a bit more than some of these things that are a little bit more uncomfortable to look at. But we are going to get to some of those things and some of the good work that's happening now and the ways that students and community members are coming together. And I think that family wealth connection is huge. Thank you, Maria.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thanks for that question. And Shane, why don't we move on, and I'll keep monitoring the chat if other questions come up.
Thank you, Terry. And I really appreciate the questions and the chance to take a quick breath. And I acknowledge this is so much information. I'll share a recording of this afterwards, as well as a number of other resources where you can dig in and you can read the sources and the newspaper articles. I think what I want to do is really capture this case that in our community, some really grievous wrongs were done that are continuing to shape our community to this day. It's not to shame any of the folks from the past. Frank Staropoli Jr., he's a good friend of mine. He's written about this story on his blog and the way his family was complicit and benefited from and participated in this. And he's proud to be able to tell that story so that he can make that change in his family and their community, knowing that and being aware of it and calling that to light. So this isn't about calling out, it's truly about calling in and inviting us to tell a fuller story about our community. And the final piece I want to talk about is policing. This is Rufus Fairwell. He was a man who owned a gas station in the Plymouth Exchange neighborhood. Person of color, he was locking up his gas station late at night. We have a big connection with redlining, with overcrowding of people in these neighborhoods. In the inner city of Rochester, there was quite a bit more policing going on, just like in these neighborhoods to this day. He was locking up his gas station. The police thought he was robbing it because of his skin color. He was arrested and brutally beaten downtown at the police station. To the left is the Reverend Caldwell and Fairwell leading a protest right in front of City Hall. But there was the Faison case. There was the case of A.C. White, the Black Muslim case, all kinds of instances where people of color in these neighborhoods had some really unfair run-ins with the Rochester Police Department that, again, it could be its own hour presentation about this. Tomorrow, I'm actually presenting to the Sheriff's Department leadership about this same story to help them understand that context as well. It's really been an honor to be invited to speak there too. And so because of all of this housing and these issues, we get an uprising, a riot, a rebellion. People call it by different names. It all happened in 1964 in a hot July night. In fact, over 1,000 people were arrested. It lasted 3 days. 1,500 National Guard troops were called out to Rochester to quell the protest and the unrest, a scene that looks very much like our community today. And when we look at this scene, it's important to consider what Carolyn Vaca, our county historian, said. She found that redlining was directly connected, that folks who have been displaced through urban renewal, through the disinvestment and lack of running water, as well as people who had been victims of police brutality, were the people that rose up in the streets and decided that they had just had enough and needed to protest and make a change in these redline neighborhoods. Rochester wasn't alone, though. Nationally, in redline neighborhoods, people of color rose up in protest, as well as white folks throughout the country in redline neighborhoods to protest this housing discrimination, the urban renewal, all the stuff that was going on. After Dr. King was killed in 1968, protests erupted again, and Lyndon Johnson used that opportunity to sign into law the Fair Housing Act of 1968. This effectively ended redlining as well as racially restrictive covenants, making it illegal, giving people of color access to FHA and VA mortgages for the first time in 1968, right? This isn't that long ago, not that long ago at all. And so when you think about that, let that sink in just a touch. The law itself was quite weak, and it didn't include any reparation for people of color to make up for the years prior. And another thing that's important to mention about this law is that there only was one department of the federal government responsible for enforcing it. If a community was failing to affirmatively further integration, the federal government, through Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, had the right to step in by removing HUD block grant funding to those towns. This has only been enforced 2 times since President Nixon, according to journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones at the New York Times. President Nixon actually fired George Romney, his HUD secretary, for trying to enforce this law. He fired them and made sure that this wasn't enforced again. And his justification for this was this. Nixon writes, "I'm convinced that while legal segregation is totally wrong, forced integration of housing or education is just as wrong." He says, "I realize this position will lead us to a situation in which Black people will continue to live, for the most part, in Black neighborhoods, like the students who go to RCSD, who attend predominantly Black schools, and predominantly white schools, like the school I attended in Webster, where I don't think I sat next to more than 1 or 2 students of color during my entire 12 years in the Webster Central School District. And I know that I never had a Black teacher." And again, like, you can see why some of this happened. It comes down to the enforcement of these policies. And so why, Sally, I so appreciate you mentioning that great strides have been made. There has been a small Black middle class that has been created, in part because of these changes in these civil rights laws. And yet, when you look at that wealth gap, that for every $5 a Black family has, a white family has $100 in wealth, it's staggering the gaps that we still have. Meanwhile, in Webster, many Webster students came together during this same period of time in the 1960s to call out segregation. A whole class at Webster High School, at the same time these blackface shows were happening in the schools, actually wrote a letter to the editor in the Democrat and Chronicle saying that they believe segregation was important, or integration should happen in their community, asking for their community leaders in town to make a change. Folks like this parent, Miss Allen, they got up at school board meetings and spoke in favor of programs like Urban Suburban that would help begin to move the needle when it came to school integration. People like Claude Johnstone, whose husband was on the town board, chaired the Webster Council of Human Rights, who worked with a cross-county group spearheaded by Loftus Carlson, an amazing leader in our community during this period of time, to make petitions where many folks in Webster signed petitions saying that they would be willing to have a Black person in their neighborhood. And they tried to welcome folks of color into a community that up to that point had almost no people of color living there. Her efforts are incredible, laudable, and ones I wish we all could learn about. In 1967, the RCSD superintendent actually came to a meeting in Webster with over 450 people who came to the meeting. And he said to Webster, "You have to play a part in ending the racial isolation and the issues that we're having in the city school district. We're one community. Maybe this community in Monroe County, we could come together." He called on Webster. He said, "At this time, you send all of your students with disabilities to the city school district to receive services that we're paying for. What we're hoping is that maybe you can join us in programs like Urban Suburban and help us kind of solve some of these problems when it comes to segregation." Time and again, the Webster board rejected these different plans. And one school board member, Donald Summers, wrote, he said the reason he was the only person to vote in favor of Urban Suburban is, he said, voluntary integration, it's a moral issue. And he said, we've got to do something about this. And because of these efforts, and yet not enough, we have so much segregation in our community still to this day, which is why, as much as I want to celebrate the good things that have happened and some of the efforts like we just did in Webster, it clearly hasn't been enough. And we have to really come together as a community again to solve them. Because when you look at the redlining map from the 30s and the census map from today, you see that the needle has not changed much in regards to racial segregation or to segregation along the lines of class, where wealth is hoarded in our community suburbs and poverty is concentrated in our inner city that's majority African American, the way it was designed in the 30s. You can compare owner occupancy to that redlining map as well. Empire Justice found that redlining continues to happen to this day. Five Star Bank just a few years ago got put on, they had to settle out of court. They got accused and confirmed that they were redlining in the Rochester area and were forced to pay a big settlement because of what was going on with their loans. And yet we know other banks are still participating in different ways, as long as they don't use race, but by location. That by location, These communities in the inner city are getting almost no home purchase loans. The denials are the highest there. The same goes for access to credit. You can see this New York Federal Reserve report. The lowest amount of access to credit is in those previously redlined neighborhoods, meaning a modern day form of redlining. I actually got to present to the head of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, the president of that bank, and some of his team a few weeks back. And it was really an honor to share with him and to thank him for some of this reporting that they have done in finding the ways that housing and credit discrimination continues to happen in these Black neighborhoods, and to push for changes. Food deserts are another incredible issue in these previously redlined neighborhoods. We know there aren't any Wegmanses in a previously redlined neighborhood. Asthma rates are the highest in redline neighborhoods today. Same with high blood pressure, same with life expectancy. In fact, a report that just came out this month said that current residents of the city Rochester neighborhoods that were historically redlined, they have a life expectancy of actually 5 full years shorter than people who live in neighborhoods that are coded green, the highest rating. So literally that 5-year gap, I can't celebrate that. We've got to come together as a community to make these changes. And it directly connects to COVID. In fact, 4 of the 5 zip codes with the most COVID-19 cases per 100,000 residents, they were redlined neighborhoods. Nationally, we have a wealth gap. According to Yale, in 2017, for every $100 the average white family has in wealth, the average Black family has only 5. It's going to take Black families 228 years to earn the same amount of wealth that white families have today, unless we do what Douglas and Stewart and Anthony did, what we've done before in this community, to come together, to face these issues head on, to tell these uncomfortable realities and stories about our town so that we can mobilize and create anti-racist policy change that are gonna make a difference. James Baldwin writes, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing, it can be changed until it is faced." And I hope today that you've been able to join me in facing the racist policies of the real estate industry's code of ethics, the way Howard Coles did when he showed people of color homes in all white neighborhoods, the way Judge Davis fought back against racial covenants on that home in the 19th Ward, the way Connie Mitchell, Dr. Cooper, and Alice Young, and so many others fought against redlining and move-in violence, the way over 1,000 people who got arrested, thousands erupted in protest in their streets, resisted urban renewal. And I hope all of us today are going to be a part of closing that racial wealth gap, that equity gap, and in solving the problems around integration in our community to this day. It's not going to be easy, but I want to leave us with this really inspiring quote before I talk about our curriculum a little bit. This is Brian Stevenson, who founded the museum down south that has the monument to lynching in America. And he says, you have to commit to truth telling first. You can't jump to reconciliation until you tell the truth. You don't have to go outside your own institution. You can begin your own truth telling. And I really hope that tonight has been the beginning for many of us in this community about starting to tell the truth about our town, not to shame, but to invite us to telling a fuller story so that reconciliation and justice can happen. And so one of the things that we've tried to do with the Pathstone Foundation's Anti-Racist Curriculum Project is to really carry this work on in the spirit of Black educators like Hannah Storrs, who fought back against Little Black Sambo, which was being taught in every RCSD school classroom in elementary school. She got it out of there. She got Black history included in these books. And we're trying to continue this legacy and tell stories like hers. The mission of our project, you can see our team and our co-lead, is to empower students and teachers to give them primary sources, instructional resources that are based 100% on the New York State social studies and ELA standards, as well as the teaching tolerant social justice standards that don't indoctrinate students, that don't tell students what to think, but put these primary sources in front of them and give them the tools to think critically about them. We want to make sure that students across our county all have access to these materials so they can draw their own conclusions about these problems, about what they think about these problems, whether they think they're problems, and what they want to do or don't want to do about addressing them and coming together as a community. It's not the job of the teacher to tell the students at all what to think. Instead, our job is to help students learn how to think critically and decide how they want to civically participate and their communities. We have widespread support from the head of the Werner School to New York State Regents, to superintendents, to folks all across our community, civil rights leaders like Ashley Gant, to Joan Coles Howard, to Dr. Walter Cooper, who have come together to try to make these changes and are overseeing this work to make sure that it's done in the right way. We want this work to be place-based, culturally responsive, developmentally appropriate, and to really be in that spirit of resistance, activism, and anti-racism. We put definitions in front of kids from Ibram Kendi, not to tell them this is the one and only definition, but to give them something to talk about, to do that in restorative circles, to think about in the context of our community, do they agree with these things? How might they change it? And they're given the permission to write them in their own words instead of being told what to think. We use restorative circles where the teacher can interrupt. Students go around the circle. They use group norms, just like we did tonight, to have those brave spaces and learn how to have these difficult conversations about race and justice like we're trying to have here tonight. They're hard, but because of these processes like restorative practices, it's going to make a difference to help them do that. When it comes to critical thinking, we have 4 superhero roles that help kids think about credibility, author's purpose, main idea, and context, and considering the redlining maps and covenants and the different pieces in our community. Students start on the outside and they work their way in using work that WCSD has done here in Rochester. We've built on that to put primary sources like these in front of the kids to help them look from multiple different angles about what happened, from multiple different perspectives, so that they can draw their own conclusions about what's happened and how to make these changes. And then to learn about people who made change, local activists, to learn from them and to use their stories to help be a part of their story in making change today if they choose. I want to close with this final story before we open up our last 20 minutes to questions. This is the story of 3 of my students who, after several years ago, hearing the stories of, you can see my friend Dr. Cooper and Dr. Alice Holloway Young, after hearing their stories, after learning about the racist policies like redlining, covenants, these girls came up to me and said, that was great, but we have racism in our school. I've never had a teacher that looks like me before who's Black. I said, you're right. Like, that seems like racism. Like, what should we do about it? And the student was like, let's talk to the principal right now. I was like, we could. But what did Dr. Cooper and Alice Young did? And she's like, they got friends, they researched, they made sure they knew what they were doing. They came up with a plan. And so that's what we did. We used their strategies for resistance and for change. The girls came together. They got friends, these other 2 friends involved. They volunteered. We got parent permission. It was all their choice. And at lunch, they researched what had happened when it came to hiring. They found we had 550 white teachers in Henrietta and only 11 Black teachers. They weren't satisfied. The chance of them having a Black teacher was incredibly small. So they developed a presentation. They gave it to the principal. They gave it to our class. And they demanded that a change be made. And then they got to speak to the assistant superintendents and the school board, and eventually folks at the community foundation, and it became a big story. And I'm proud to say that because of these girls and the leadership of great folks in our district, today we have 3 historically Black colleges that we're actively working with to help recruit and create a feeder pattern so that students like Hollyott have the teacher that looks like them that they truly deserve. And this is them having voice in their school and their community. And isn't that the goal of education? That kids learn their voice, that they're empowered, they're given tools to make their own decisions, draw their own conclusions, and to help build the community that they want to live in. And so what I'd love to do is talk with you about the ways you've been impacted by these policies, what value you see in sharing this story with our students. And also, I would just love to hear your thoughts, your comments, your reflections. I'd love to hear your pushback, because the thing is, this is just part of the story. And my hope today is to expose all of us to a little bit of this story so that we can come together and move forward to build a more just Webster, a more just Rochester, Monroe County, and nation. I'm grateful for this opportunity. And what I'll do is Terry, do you mind picking questions from the chat to share with me, and then we can start having that conversation? Does that work, Terry?
Of course, absolutely. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you, Shane, and hopefully catch your breath for a minute. And it's just like, it's so awesome. And my guess is we could you probably have enough information to take us through till about 11 o'clock at night.
I could, but you don't want that.
Yeah, but we'll respect your time, and we'll do that hard stop at 8 o'clock. So we do have a couple of questions coming in. And one of the biggest questions, or multiple times it's come in, is what about pushback from parents who maybe are concerned about the curriculum being that it maybe tells a story that they aren't aware of or don't want their kids to be aware of. How have you dealt with that sort of resistance?
Absolutely. Well, first, we give information to parents, access to see the resources that we're doing with kids. We want parents, just like with any difficult subject, from slavery to the election, like we're in right now, we always have had hard conversations in classrooms, and we let parents know ahead of time. And we want to assure parents that teachers are trained and able to sort of do some of this work and to do it in a way where students don't feel. Oh, real quick, in the chat, I put a bunch of stuff. The link to some of our curriculum resources and FAQs that talk about the way the work is done. Because that's what I think is really important, to not have pushback. It has to be done in a way where teachers aren't getting up there and telling kids all about the things that they think about our community and what needs to change. It's got to be student-centered. It's got to be primary source-based and rooted in the New York State social studies standards around civil rights, the New Deal, and the importance of local history. And so we're drawing on those things. We're using the ELA standards around opinion, around drawing conclusions and using reasons and evidence to support those examples that tie right into those standards. So everything that we're doing is rooted in that approach. And we're creating space for kids to participate in civic discourse and conversation. And that's one of the things that for many parents who maybe initially are concerned, like, I don't know if I want my teacher talking to my kid about this stuff. What are they going to tell them? What if they tell them the wrong things? What if they tell my kid something different than what my kid learned at home, right? I mean, that's the thing, is we want parents to talk about this at home, to share their diverse views on this story, and to look at these primary sources as well and have that conversation with their kids and talk about their community, what they think this says about their community, what they want their community to look like, or what they're happy with. And I think knowing that our approach is that, this is not something whatsoever about telling kids what to think. It's just like any kind of social studies. We put primary sources in front of kids and we give them the critical thinking tools to think about it. Teachers who are doing this are undergoing a 3-hour training where they actually do the same curriculum that kids do. I know we've trained a number of folks in Webster in this. People like Terry and folks all across our community have had a ton of input on how we can do that in a way that's culturally responsive for our students from all different kinds of backgrounds, from students who maybe their parents aren't as excited about their kids learning this history, to parents who are extremely excited about having this in the classroom. And so I think that's a big piece. And then the teaching tolerant social justice standards provide a developmentally appropriate framework that help us gear our sources to be developmentally appropriate at each of the grade levels we're working at. Again, I could probably talk for 2 hours about what we're doing with the curriculum and all kinds of things, but I think that's just a little bit of the basics that I think helps kind of assuage some of those fears. Again, people are always going to have an issue with things that get taught in school, but to me, if we're doing good work as teachers, where we're empowering students and teaching them to think and letting them make their own decisions, I think that's the kind of thing where most folks are going to say, all right, like, I'm glad my kids are learning about diverse perspectives, seeing things from different angles, and that they have that space to think what they want to think. I think that's really important and just part of being a part of our country and a democracy.
Excellent. And as a social studies guy, the director of social studies, the connections to the social studies curriculum, explicit connections, and more importantly, the social studies practices that are integrated into the social studies curriculum, particularly around civic action. One of the things we talk a lot about in every social studies department I've been part of, the conversation has been, we want students to be actively participating citizens, yet we often don't give children or students an opportunity to actually practice that. What does that actually mean? And this is an opportunity to give kids a chance to try that. So thanks so much, Shane. And the questions are coming fast and furious. So I really appreciate everything. We got one in from the somebody who's watching on the live stream. So it's almost like the request line here. Can you recommend any additional reading or documentary materials that high school students and parents can read and watch together, knowing that parents of school-age students didn't learn about this in school?
Yep, I just put a link with a bunch of great resources. I
Okay,
definitely recommend reading The Color of Law. You'll see a 17-minute video from Richard Rothstein. That's
great.
an animated video that really tells this story in a way that's just here are the facts, and it's animated, really accessible. My video recording of this is on there, that if you wanted to watch it with your kid, that's fantastic. But also all of our materials and primary sources. We've got a database of over 250 primary sources that are Rochester specific. You can go on and read the deeds from every one of these towns, see every one of the minstrel shows, read each of these commissions and reports that I referenced today, and just, unpack a source together, get deep with it. And I know these conversations are being held throughout the community. I know libraries are putting this on. Books like Stamped by Jason Reynolds and Ibram Kendi is a great place to start. Strongly recommend reading that one, probably. Stamped by Ibram Kendi and Jason Reynolds would be another really great place.
Excellent. Great. Thank you. And so there's a question about practices. So there's somebody who is interested in getting started with that, and any suggestions that you might have.
Absolutely. So I actually do some work with Peary, and Peary uses, they're called Partners in Restorative Institute. I'm almost positive. Shira May is their director. They're fantastic. They're located at the Mennonite Church. I know they've trained almost every teacher in Rush Henrietta. I'm not sure if Webster has done too much work with them yet, but
We
they
have,
just do
yeah.
fantastic. They train in restorative practices where, just like today, you set group norms. You have a commitment to taking turns. People take a turn in the circle. You know when it's your turn. It's almost that simple. And there's this commitment that we're going to seek to understand from one another. After people share, you go back around the circle again, and students have a chance to respond to what other people said. It forces people to pause and to think. It keeps people from just sort of reacting and cross-talking and fighting about an issue. And I think it really promotes students understanding each other and understanding different views, from the student who maybe is really resistant to learning this story to the student who is just so angry that this happened in our community. It gives space for all those students to share, and it provides protection for them to have those conversations. Peary does free trainings for parents, teachers, and just anyone in the community around this work. And they actually use one of the circles from our curriculum as a part of their regular 3-day training that they do as an academic circle. So it's some really cool work that they're doing. But I know Rock Restorative in the city, the Gandhi Institute does some really cool stuff. And in our training, we also do some really cool training with this.
Yeah, and we're blessed in this region to have so many wonderful institutions and organizations that are doing this work, and certainly something that we really appreciate. And one of the great things about the restorative circle practice, when we think about for our kids often don't see adults having conversations like this and about these difficult topics, and so we don't give them a chance to model and have those spaces to have the conversations. And the restorative practice allows that environment to exist. So thanks for sharing that. Okay, so another question was if there's a question about teaching a lot of this work pairing with Black Lives Matter and how it might be similar to other civil rights movements?
Yes, great question. I think it's really important. We're in the midst of a massive protest movement. Protests that happen almost every night in the beginning of the fall. The killing of Daniel Prude, of George Floyd. Students know about this, right? Kids know about it and they have questions. So restorative circles are an amazing way to have these conversations. And I think the stories of redlining and racial covenants tell a lot of context about the neighborhoods where this happened. Where Daniel Prude was killed, that was on Jefferson Avenue, a street that you saw in my talk a number of times in a red line neighborhood, a heavily policed neighborhood, both past and present. Again, I don't think our job as teachers is to tell kids whatsoever what to think about it. But I think it's really important for them to learn about how the hundreds, really I would argue thousands of teenagers have gone to these protest marches and rallies and participated. The DNC just published an article yesterday about youth activists, white and Black, from the suburbs to the city, who have participated in this protest movement for change. I think it's really important for kids to have a chance to learn about that, to read, just like we do with the curriculum, to read a variety of sources, to take a look at it, but to also know the context that Daniel Prude is not the first time that this has happened. RPD, we've got Denise Hawkins, Calvin Green, Kenneth Jackson, and there's a whole list of names in our community of folks that have died in police custody. Again, not to tell kids what to think, but to tell them this is stuff that happened, to let them read the articles, to learn about Stokely Carmichael coming to Rochester after Denise Hawkins died and the massive protests that occurred then. Or again, when Alicia McCullers, the daughter of the head of Action for a Better Community, was killed by the RPD. Like, this is a story. It's not an old story in Rochester, or not a new story in Rochester. It's an old story. And giving kids that context, just like with anything, I think is so important. Again, not to tell them what to think, but to give them that piece and to put it in the larger efforts of folks like Dr. Cooper, who helped in the Rufus Fairwell case, trying to get him justice and a settlement to help him pay his medical bills and receive the compensation that he got, that he eventually did get. Many of these folks are still alive, and to tell those stories, I think, can be really important with kids and to let them see it from lots of perspectives. So a movie like July 64, it gives all kinds of perspectives, from the mayor to the police chief, to activists, to youth who are participating in the uprisings of 64. I think the same way is the way we need to talk about the current movements. Let kids see lots of different perspectives, use restorative circles to have those tough conversations. Great question.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Shane. A couple more questions about Rush Henrietta's path to recruiting through in connection with the HBCUs.
Connection with HBCUs. I'm not the director of that. I'm only telling you what my director of human services, Pat McHugh, knows. Reach out to Pat. I'm sure he'd love to talk to you. I know it's a really tough thing to do that kind of recruiting. I think a lot of culture and climate has to change in our schools. I mean, for me, I'd imagine it'd be tough if I went to a school where I was the only white teacher and every other teacher was Black or Hispanic. That might be a little uncomfortable. I think we have the same thing in districts like Henrietta and Webster, where every teacher is white and the culture and climate is quite a bit of stuff going on there. I saw one thing in the chat that I wanted to bring up. Someone mentioned the implicit bias test that I guess students were given. I think that's a fascinating test. It's one thing. I'd be more in favor of students having choice around whether or not they want to do something like that. But I think implicit bias is an important thing for us to continue to talk about. But I'm most focused on what are the policies that created where we are and what are the policies that can be changed, and helping kids sort of think about that. Great question. Yeah, and then the comment around developmentally appropriate. And I think that's definitely where the teacher art comes in, I think, Shane, is definitely knowing your kids and we have great faith in our teachers. And I know there's many teachers on here, both who work in Webster and throughout the community, and knowing what is right to put in front of your kids. So let's see. There's a question about if students are able to see the connection between the wealth gap and the policies. Absolutely. On day one of our curriculum, students see they see the segregation map, the census data. They're not told segregation. They draw that conclusion. Every year, my fourth graders draw that conclusion on their own without any leading from me. That, like, wow, that's our community. And then we look at the Act Rochester report, and they look at the graphs, and they see those kinds of things. And so to tie in with that white privilege question that I think I saw someone tie into the chat there, they're able to look at that and see that's where some of that white privilege it is. Like, and I guess I know for me, some of the privileges that I had going to Webster schools, as many of my friends' parents were doctors, lawyers. So one of my best friend's dad was a professor at Geneseo. Like, I had a terrible SAT score, guys. I don't know how I got into college, but I do know because my friend's dad is a professor at Geneseo and he wrote me a letter of recommendation. Those social connections, those privileges, my skin color, I think each of those things kind of tie in. I also think, do you remember that statistic from the very beginning about white privilege literally being life itself? Dr. Ibram Kendi has talked about that a lot in his work, that nationally the life expectancy between white and Black is quite significant. You saw that in red line neighborhoods in Rochester, where it's predominantly Black, people are living up to 5 years less. So I think that can be white privilege. White privilege can mean people aren't making assumptions about you based on your race that are negative. because of your skin color. I think there's a whole list of things. I know Robin DiAngelo's book does a good job digging into that. And I also think Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist give a really good primer. And I think those kind of things are key. But I think it's easy to get lost in the weeds of talking about white privilege or white fragility or about, we talk so much about how to be polite and politically correct in having these conversations. I think instead we've got to just be like, we have to have group norms. We have to acknowledge this is going to be hard and messy. We have to call people out when we have issues and stop kind of playing the finger pointing feelings game and instead say, okay, what can we agree on in our community? We know it's segregated. We know there's massive health inequity when it comes to life expectancy. We know school segregation is prevalent. We know we have, I think, one teacher of color in the Webster Central School District. Okay, as a community, can we agree on those things? And let's come together and let's create policy change around those things. And let's let our students be a part of that process if that's something that they want to be a part of. So I think that's more how I would get at that sort of question and make sure our focus continues to be on that anti-racist action. That's the thing that people want to do.
Excellent. Well, Shane, I think that's a great place to wrap up. Let me just say on behalf of the entire Fire Steering Committee, and we're so excited to have you and really appreciate all the time and effort and energy you've put into this. And we're proud to say that you're a Webster grad, and we're proud to continue this work back as we continue our work with fire and throughout our community. So thank you for everybody for joining us. I will email out the link that Shane shared with the documents, and hopefully if the recording went well, I'll have a recording and I'll email that out as well, or at least a link if people wanted to see that. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful evening. Be safe, and we'll look for you at our November fire meeting. Take care.
Thank you, Terry. It's truly an honor to be here with all of you and being in my hometown. Thank you.
Thanks, Shane. Good night, everybody.
Have a good one. Hey, Brian. Brian, I can unmute you real quick here. You had a couple of questions that I'm just looking through the chat. I wasn't able to see them till the chat. Were you able to get the presentation link, Brian? Not sure if you're able to unmute, Brian.
Oh, you know what? I can unmute him.
Okay, just.
I thought I could. Brian,
I think he has to unmute himself. I just asked to unmute. Maybe he stepped away.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Do you know Brian's email?
Yes, I do.
Oh, okay. Can you share those links with him in my email? Because I'd be happy to chat with him if he wants.
Okay.
All right. Terry, what'd you think? Good.
It was great. And I think we're still live streaming. So.
All right. Hold on. Let me cancel that.